Today we're going to talk about addiction, whether it's actually a disease or not, and I'll be discussing the changes addiction causes in the brain and how it affects us mentally, spiritually, and how it affects family and community. So what I would like you guys to think for a second or two is what comes to your mind when you hear the word addiction. This is the first thing that comes to your mind. So that's your definition, your concept of addiction, and then we'll compare that with the known definitions of addiction. So let's start with the word addiction. Where did that originate from? It's a Latin word that means enslaved or bound to. That's what addiction means. Now, what is addiction? The standard definition of addiction is that it is a continued repetition of a behavior despite adverse consequences. And that's important to note. The latter part is important to note because that shows we have no control. Now, the American Medical Association has a definition of addiction, and they call it that addiction is marked by craving, increased tolerance to a substance, denial of negative consequences, and dysfunctional emotional responses. That's what the AMA says. Now, I came up with the definition combining all these various sources with one of my colleagues, Dr. Beaver, and we call it that addiction is an irresistible behavior originally desiring to provide pleasure or relieve distress, and then goes on to create problems and interferes with our lives. They all mean about the same thing. It's how you put it in context. Now, the signs of addiction. Let's go over the various signs of addiction. There is increased absence from work and social routines. There is isolation and secretive behavior. That's another clue that we need to look out for. There are changes in appetite and sleep patterns. There's unusual or increased irritability. And then there are financial problems or an unexplained need for money. And then they also start having severe mood swings. So anytime you notice somebody with unusual and unexplained behavioral changes, that is a clue that maybe there's an addiction in play there. So let's go over the symptoms of addiction. It starts with tolerance leading to withdrawal and loss of control. Then there is inability to stop. And then there's neglect of life. And that's where you know that there is no control. And then there is a continued use despite harming oneself. And that's what it leads to. Now, addiction is basically described as a primary chronic disease of the brain, reward, motivation, memory circuit, and the related circuits to that. So it deals with the reward, motivation, and memory. So we need to remember that. And this is the description from the American Medical Association. Now we are asking the question, is addiction a brain disease? Let's look a little deeper as to the moral aspect of it. Is it a moral failing? The moral model actually fails to account for the physical symptoms of addiction. Then the brain imaging shows changes in structure and function. So in other words, we have actually tangible evidence, scientific evidence of changes, structural changes in the brain. And the empirical studies support a biologic basis of addiction. So now, addiction could be a brain disease, it could be a spiritual disease, or it could be an emotional disease. It's a combination of all the above. So we have to keep that in mind. It's all encompassing. It can completely overtake your life. Now, people call addiction as a brain disease, as we have been talking about. It's chronic and relapsing in nature. It can also lead ultimately to cancer and heart disease and many other medical ailments. Now, this is the structure of the brain that I'm just showing. It's a depiction of the various parts of the brain. For example, the cortex that you can see right on the top, that's responsible for our motor functions, sensory functions. And if you go to the frontal part, the prefrontal cortex is responsible for cognition. Then there's a corpus callosum, which is a band that connects the two hemispheres. Then we have the cerebellum at the back. Then we have the hypothalamus for temperature control and various things like that. Pituitary gland that is shown here. It's called the master gland in the brain. And then the amygdala. I saved the best for the last. And amygdala is what we're going to be dealing with a lot as far as addiction is concerned. And we'll discuss that down the line. This is a colored slide depiction of the various functions. It's the functional parts of the brain, and if you look at it, you have an area which is for the movement, that's called the premotor cortex. Sensations is past the precentral gyrus, the postcentral gyrus, that's responsible for that. Then you have it shows the area responsible for judgment, that's prefrontal cortex. At the back, which is called the occipital lobe, responsible for vision. And then the cerebellum, that's shown coordination, and then you have the memory, and then the arrow that shows there's a point there for the reward system that you see on the slide, and that's really what is involved in addiction. So let's go over some of the brain facts that are known. The brain weighs approximately 3 pounds, and there are about 100 billion cells, brain cells called neurons, and there are about 1 trillion supporting cells. The neurons grow and organize themselves into efficient systems that actually last a lifetime. And now there is also a new field called neuroplasticity, which shows that the brain can actually, the synapses which are responsible for our intellect, for memory, the synapses continue to form well into our 60s, 70s, maybe even 90s. And that's a new concept. Before they said that the brain stopped maturing beyond the age of maybe, initially they said it was in the teenage years, 14, 15 years, then they moved it to 18, 19, then 24, 25. But now they say that neuroplasticity continues to happen throughout our lives. So in other words, we should never give up. When we think that, okay, nothing is going to change, that's not true anymore. The brain can undergo changes for a long time. And it controls all our activities, as we know, physical activities, emotional activities, cognitive functions, and those things happen by creating new circuits in the brain. And we also have to remember the effect of the environment on the brain development for a child, for example. And so the most important fact to remember here is that it never stops adapting and changing. And that gives us hope, especially with addiction. Now this slide shows a healthy brain on the left side and an addicted brain on the right side. And to anybody, you don't have to have a scientific medical knowledge to see the difference. You can see how damaged the brain is on the right side. And this is a different type of scan on the brain that shows you can see so many holes in the brain. The brain is getting destroyed, the one on the right side, and that's what happens with addiction. And here I've shown, in this slide I've shown 3 sections of the brain. The left one is normal, the one in the middle is active heroin use, and you can see that there are all these holes. It's almost like Swiss cheese that's formed in the brain in the middle one. But then after stopping the use of the drug, heroin in this case, you can see on the slide on the one on the right side, that how the brain has again started reforming and getting its original shape and size and functions back. And here is a picture of a young male, just 24 years old. You can see on the left hand side, this is how he was in 2010, normal, and then see what happened after he got addicted. And then he was charged. He had a charge for a drug crime, and then see the transformation in him. So the changes that are taking place in the brain are also happening simultaneously in the body. So you can see changes in the body, then you also start seeing changes in the brain, and they're all happening simultaneously. And here you see another young female where you can see the significant transformation after she got a beautiful young lady, as you can see on the left side, and see what the drug does physically. It's devastating. Then it devastates a family too. So here is a slide of the brain, which is a very simple slide talking about sort of the new brain and the old brain. The oldest part of the brain is called the reptilian brain, which, as you can see in this slide, is in the innermost part of the brain, and in fact the amygdala actually is a part of that system there. And then you have the middle brain, and then you have the new brain, which is the cortex, which is all over the highest part and the frontal part of the brain. And that's what differentiates human beings from animals. In other words, we have this highly developed part of the brain that helps us think, rationalize, have our intellect, and that's how the human beings evolved. So we are talking about this brain that has gone through billions of years of evolution with a B to get to this point and to differentiate human beings from animals. Now the next slide, this again shows in a more simplistic way, so that I want you guys to remember this when you think about the brain, that there is this reptilian brain which is really for the fight, flight and freeze response. It's a defense, automatic defense response that animals have. We also have that. And then the limbic system, responsible for emotions and things like that, and then the neocortex, which is the most sort of the newest part of the brain. Now this is, I was talking about the reptilian response, so here's a reptile for you. And then this again shows the instant gratification behavior. You see the reptile holding this drug in his mouth. It's because this is depicting the gratification behavior that we really, our brain starts functioning at that level. In other words, we stop using the neocortex, the functional part of the brain that we have, and then go down to the very primitive reflexes, which is for self-gratification, using basically the reptilian part of the brain. And we stop using the cognitive part in addiction, and that is a big problem. And the next one, this slide again shows that there is something called the reward circuit that you will see in the brain. It has the nucleus accumbens, and then in the reward circuit is what is basically involved, and that's what we want to feed into. We want to satisfy our reward circuit in the brain, and that is the problem that we have with addiction, is that it becomes an insatiable type of behavior, that we want to keep rewarding the reward system in an unlimited, infinite fashion. And this again is another slide showing you the reward system and how the various drugs here, I'm talking about cocaine, alcohol, even nicotine, heroin, how they basically get into the reward system and perpetuate this vicious cycle of addiction. Here there are several, I'm showing several neurotransmitters here. The ones really that I want you to remember is, we have, here I'm showing norepinephrine, serotonin, dopamine, but the most important one is dopamine in the reward circuit. All these other ones are involved. As you can see, there's so much overlap of functions between the different neurotransmitters, controlling our anxiety, there is impulse, irritability, and all these things. It also affects our appetite and things like that. And so you can see that the neurotransmitters are the ones that are responsible for all our behavior, our cognitive functions, non-cognitive functions by these neurotransmitters, and those are the ones that get affected by addiction, and that's what I will talk about some more. So here is a slide of a synapse. This is what happens in the brain, that you have a presynaptic structure, then you have the synapse, which is the gap, and that's the gap is where the vesicles from the presynaptic area, those vesicles are filled with neurotransmitters, and then the neurotransmitters come out of those vesicles, go into the synapse, which is the gap, and the synapse is where they get transmitted. The actual neurotransmitters travel on a transporter, which I'll show you, and then they go to the receptors in the postsynaptic area. And this slide shows that. You see this big structure like the foot. Inside are the vesicles. The vesicles are filled with dopamine, as you can see. And then the other end, in the postsynaptic area, you see the receptor. Now, the dopamine, which is inside the vesicle, somehow has to get triggered and come out of those vesicles, travel through the space in the synapse, and then get attached to the receptor. And how that happens is basically it goes through a transporter. Now on this slide you will see that we need the normal neurohormone release. We're talking about dopamine here, so I'll just stick to dopamine as an example. And even there is a normal natural reward system that we all have. And there is release of dopamine when we kiss somebody out of love, when you hug somebody, and when we receive praise. All these things actually stimulate our reward system, release dopamine in the normal mechanism. So in other words, we do have release of dopamine that comes out of the presynaptic vesicles, gets carried by a transporter, goes to the postsynaptic area where it's get attached to the right spot, and that gives us that feeling of happiness and joy inside. Now what happens with drugs? What it does is it increases the level of dopamine to the point that it goes sky high. And as you see in the next slide, the The transporter that I talked about that carries the dopamine from the presynaptic area to the postsynaptic area, that transporter is actually blocked. So when that gets blocked, you have this enormous amount of dopamine that's released, and then there is increased sensitivity in the postsynaptic area. So you get this exaggerated effect that you normally see in normal hugging and kissing and getting praise. That kind of pleasure that you normally experience is heightened, goes sky high. And then of course that has its consequences too, as you can see in this next slide. On the left hand side you see the normal amount of vesicles and the dopamine that's released. And then on the right side you see after cocaine, for example, is how sensitized the postsynaptic area is. So in other words, instead of having a small area of sensitivity, now it's completely goes up 10, 15, it goes up in enormous amounts, high proportions, and that cannot be sustained because the vesicles get depleted too. So let me talk, on this slide I'm talking about the neurobiology of compulsion and its persistence. So you have tolerance, you have sensitization, then that leads to dependency, which is an adapted state, and then it leads to addiction, where there is loss of control. And this is a very important slide that I really want you to have this imprinted in your brain. It's called amygdala hijacking. And remember I mentioned the structure of amygdala earlier, which is a part of the primitive brain structure, brain system. And that is responsible normally for our fight, flight, or freeze response. Animals, when they get attacked, they have this automatic defense mechanism where they get, they just flee or they fight or they just freeze. So we all have that, but they don't have the higher functions to control that as human beings do. So as you can see in the upper part of the slide, there's if you have any normal sensory input that goes through the amygdala, and the normal pathway is from the amygdala, it goes to the prefrontal cortex, which is our cognitive center for our rational, logical, analytical thinking. And then that leads to a balanced response. But what happens in addiction is that it gets short-circuited, as you can see, and that's why the amygdala gets hijacked in this mechanism. And so the input doesn't go to the prefrontal cortex, which means that you don't have a balanced response anymore. So you're responding in a very primitive fashion, just like you're being attacked. So like if you're in a dark alley, for example, and you see a dark figure, and you're afraid, and you may either run or you fight or you freeze. And then, whereas what happens, and that's amygdala response, that's our defense response. But if we think further, let's say you see something that looks like a rope on the ground, and that rope, if you think it's a snake, your mind is going to react as though it was a snake. It doesn't matter what the actual structure is. But if you step back and you rationalize and let your prefrontal cortex come into play, then you look at it more carefully and say, well, this is not a snake. So you have allowed the normal response, a balanced response, to take place when you have given it time and given it a logical, rational thinking. Whereas if you just respond in a reflex way, you're going to react like that. So what does it do? When you have amygdala hijacking, as this slide shows, there's something called cognitive dissonance. In other words, your cognition is not in synchrony with what is necessary for the trigger. So you start depersonalizing and you start blaming other people, you start projecting. And so this cognitive dissonance in this slide, as you'll see, is very dangerous because it allows the addict to deny, to justify, to rationalize, to intellectualize, and then to project. So on this slide you'll see that the risk factors for addiction, it's a multifactorial basis for addiction. So there's genetics to play, and the genetics has a role. Then the onset, as to what age the addiction actually started, and I'll go over slides to show you the development of the brain with age. If there's childhood trauma, if there's associated other mental illnesses, and that's a big factor actually. A lot of the addicts do have co-occurring illnesses in terms of other mental illnesses. Now, which started first and what led to what is not very clear, but the important fact to remember is that a lot of the people with mental illness do have addiction. And then I told you I will talk about the cognitive development, and this slide shows that. So you have a sensory motor stage, which is from birth to 2 years, and then the pre-operational stage is from 2 to 5 years, and then the concrete or the operational stage is from 6 to 12 years, and then the formal operational stage is from 12 years to adulthood. So you have to remember these cognitive stages of development, which will allow you to treat the patient appropriately, because the management style is going to vary depending on what the age of onset was. That's a huge factor in managing addicts. So this may look like a complicated slide, but please ignore what's written in small print on the left hand side. But suffice it to say that the parietal lobe starts maturing from age 12 on, but the frontal lobe, that starts maturing between 18 to 25 years, which is what I was talking about, is that your brain is still developing, and you're developing a personality until almost 25 years of age. So that fact is very important to remember. Now, so if you look at the brain itself, there's something that the development of the brain is actually from back to front. So in other words, the younger the children, the most posterior, the most back part of the brain is called the occipital lobe, which is responsible for our vision. And then the brain starts developing that way from back to front. In other words, if you recall, I said that the prefrontal cortex is the most developed part of the brain, the most highly developed part from an intellectual perspective, rational perspective. And that's a prefrontal part of the brain right in front here. And that is the last part to develop, and that's somewhere between 18 to 25 years. So the development is from back to front that way. And the next one, of course, shows there may be a slight gender variation in addicts. In other words, different drugs will respond, different genders may respond differently, or even the choice of drugs might be slightly different from gender to gender. So men are more likely to use cannabis, cocaine, and amphetamines, and women are more likely to use prescription opioid and tranquilizers. Again, this is too much of a generalization. Of course, they both can use either of these, any of these drugs. So, okay, let's now move on to what characterizes addiction. It's characterized by physical, psychological, social, and spiritual dysfunction. As you will see in this slide, there's something called the biopsychosocial model. And that's who we are. The human beings, we are not, you may look at somebody and only look at the physical aspect of that person. But that is only a very small part of what that person is. There is a psychological component, there is a social component, there is a spiritual component, which I think is the most important. As you can see on this slide, the biological, psychological, social, and spiritual components. Now this is the model. This slide shows what's called the body-person model. This is from an integrative medicine perspective. Integrative medicine is really trying to get the best of both worlds. In other words, combining the best of what Western medicine has to provide with the Eastern philosophy. Now that's an integrative model. Now the body person in the integrative model is very similar to the biopsychosocial model that we talked about, but this one just shows these 4 circles that depict the different parts of the body person. One is a physical, then you have a psychosocial, then you have an energetic, and the spiritual components. Now what happens in the materialistic approach, which is the Western medicine approach, as you see on the left side, there is a lot of emphasis on the physical aspect alone, at the almost complete exclusion of the spiritual and the energetic components. They may have a little bit of involvement in the psychosocial, but it's primarily focused on the physical. So we are really missing out a big portion of the human body person structure. In other words, we are focusing on the tree rather than the forest. So that approach might make you miss the forest for the trees. Whereas in the non-materialistic or the integrative approach, all the 4 components, the physical, the psychosocial, the energetic, and the spiritual components are all considered together with a lot of interaction. So that is a better approach, and that's what really works for addiction too, that we are bringing in the other elements rather than just the physical changes of the physical part. We bring in the social, psychological, and the spiritual components. And the spiritual component, as you'll see through my talk, there's a lot of emphasis on that. Because the only thing that has really worked on alcoholics, for example, is AA, which has stood the test of time, and that has a spiritual basis to it. So we talked about addiction being physical, having a genetic component, there's an environmental influence obviously, then the spiritual thing. So overall it's a very complex scenario. It's not a simple thing that you can point a finger and say, okay, this is it. That's not it. It's much more complex than that. So genetics is a big contributor to addiction, as you can see in this slide. And the nature of the involvement of genetics with addiction is not clearly known, but there's definitely some contribution from that. So this is what happens, as you see in this slide. You just completely shut out from the world, and the world is chaotic outside and the world is chaotic inside, and you're trying to escape. And you're trying to escape, you're raising the dopamine levels to think, oh man, I'm going to feel so high, and then once that gets depleted, you're always running, you're always craving. So now let's move on to the next part of this talk, which is what are the types of addiction. Now there are many, many different types of addiction, as one can imagine. Does anybody know what the commonest type of addiction is? It's food addiction, as far as stats are concerned. But then you have addiction that's compulsive sex. There's internet addiction these days, and a lot of our kids are suffering from that. That's causing isolation, and they're becoming asocial or antisocial. And then of course drugs that we're talking about, drugs and alcohol. I put drugs and alcohol in the same category. And then there is gambling, and then there's also excessive exercise. Remember, anything you do in excess is a type of addiction. Just like I talked about the neurotransmitter dopamine, it's not like addiction and the drugs are creating different hormones in the body. What they're doing is they're taking the physiological levels to unphysiological or hyperphysiological, much higher levels than the body can tolerate. And then of course they start tolerating it. So they're basically stimulating the production of the same neurohormones that we have, but to an abnormal level. And if you do the subject our body to the same thing like excessive exercise, that's also a type of addiction that can cause injuries, and it can also cause problems. So this slide shows that the drugs primarily work by imitating or overproducing neurotransmitters, like I just mentioned, to feed the brain's reward circuit, and I showed you the reward circuit earlier. And then that starts interfering with the normal functions. And the thing to remember here is, if you remember one of the slides I showed earlier, the memory area in the brain is very close to the reward system. So if that system is affected, they're all contiguous areas in the brain. So what will happen is it will also affect your memory. Now we know that the addiction affects our lives as depicted by this slide. It affects not only the individuals, which is our self, so in other words our brain. It affects the family, it affects the community, whether it's involved in the church, etc. So in other words, addiction is not just a disease of the individual. It doesn't affect just the individual. It has this enormous effect, going from family, community, and goes on, and ultimately the entire human community, I guess, the earth, the planet. So this slide shows you that. You start with the individual right in the center of the slide, and then you can see how it starts expanding and really involving the entire, the much bigger structure, communities, etc. We have to remember that addiction without treatment usually results in disability or death, as shown by this slide. But there is hope. There is hope in addiction recovery. And that hope is because of what I told you from a medical scientific perspective, that the brain has the capacity to change until into your late, maybe 70s, 80s, to your whole life. It does have a capacity to change. Even though you do form your personality, and that prefrontal cortex development is somewhere between 18 to 25 years, but the synaptic changes which are responsible for our thinking, for our memory and everything else, that's how the brain functions, by creating new synapses. That continues throughout our life, and that's why there is hope. So there is the thing with addiction and how to overcome all this, addiction. One approach which has been most effective is having a spiritual faith, as shown by this slide. Believing in a loving God, to love your neighbor as you love yourself, and to be within a supportive environment, and then when to trust and when not to trust. I think trust is a huge thing. I talk about trust a lot in dealing with addiction, and that becomes the key in trying to get somebody out of it, and then that ultimately restores joy and happiness. So in recovery and healing, as you can see in this slide, we have to do self-care, we have to lead a balanced life, we have to do counseling, and then attend support groups, and then setting boundaries. I have a whole other talk about doing all these things, which I'm not covering in this talk, as to how we set boundaries, how those things are important. So here I talk about the holistic approach with addiction, as to the basis for that is a spiritual basis. So if you understand that addiction affects you physically, mentally, spiritually, then to treat addiction we have to approach it that way, treating the whole 4 parts of the body person, the biopsychosocial model that I talked about, with the concept that the body, the human beings that we see, their mind, their body and spirit is really connected as one unit. So it's called the connectedness, or the concept of oneness. And with that approach, I usually teach mindfulness and use mindfulness as a tool to treat addiction. So I'll stop with that. As you can see in this slide, the various things, how addiction is going to help, how this approach is going to help. So I'll let you guys take a minute or two to see this concluding slide and see what the meditating dog is doing and what's going through his mind. Thank you.